We're going to have a look now at some of the challenges that Elizabeth faced when she became queen, but not any old challenges that any Tudor monarch might have faced, but particularly the challenges that Elizabeth faces because she's Elizabeth and because she was born who she was and because she's had the kind of experiences that she's had. Now, just to look quickly at the kind of person that she was, Elizabeth was really well educated. And she's also highly intelligent. She's very, very clever. She's also probably what I would call shrewd. So, here we go. So she's clever. She's educated. But she's also really good at understanding the way that things work. She understands how politics works at the time. She understands what her role is. She understands how court is, and she's able to use that knowledge. So she's very clever. She's also very accomplished. It means she's good at things. So, for example, she can speak French and Italian and Latin and Greek. And she's what we call charismatic. This is really a way of saying that she's kind of got star quality, really. She's really good at speaking. She makes very inspiring speeches. She's interesting. People are interested to hear what she has to say and they're interested in what she does. And this is a real strength as queen as well. So she's charismatic. I'll put that here. She's quite bad-tempered, so there are stories about her throwing punches at members of the Privy Council. She's strong-willed. She's also very cautious, so she takes a long time to make decisions about things. Sometimes this winds the Privy Council up. So she has a lot of strengths as queen, but she also has a lot of challenges when she becomes queen, because there are issues around the fact that she's a ruler. Now, the first of these is an issue around what we call legitimacy. Very specifically, this is an issue around whether or not her parents were married when she was born. And this was a really, really big deal at the time. If your parents weren't married, then you were seen as being born out of wedlock, you were illegitimate, and that meant that you couldn't inherit anything, including the crown. If you remember, Elizabeth was the daughter of Henry VIII. And of Anne Boleyn. And actually, they were married when Elizabeth was born, because they got married on the 25th of January 1533, and then Elizabeth was born on the 7th of September 1533. So they'd been married for a good few months before she came along. However, as you remember, in order to marry Anne Boleyn, Henry had to divorce his first wife, whose name was Catherine of Aragon, and in order to do that he had to remove the entire English church from the Roman Catholic Church and cause all kinds of problems in doing so. So there are a lot of people who didn't necessarily agree with that, particularly Catholics, and Catherine of Aragon was actually still alive when Elizabeth was born. So there were some people who didn't agree that Henry and Anne Boleyn's marriage counted for anything. They didn't think it worked. They probably didn't say so because some people were put to death by Henry for suggesting that Elizabeth wasn't legitimate. But it was quite controversial at the time. Things get even worse because Anne Boleyn is then accused of all kinds of horrible things like adultery and witchcraft, and is executed and is beheaded by Henry. And after that, Henry then claims himself that Elizabeth wasn't legitimate because he wasn't properly married, because Anne Boleyn had bewitched him because she was a witch. So even if people had agreed with the marriage in the first place, which they didn't, Henry himself then cast doubt over it, and then he changes his mind and says that Elizabeth is legitimate. But you can see that by the time she became queen, it's a little bit of an issue. So there's this question over her legitimacy. One of the things that Elizabeth tries to do is to sort of sell the idea of Anne Boleyn as a kind of Protestant martyr who died for the Protestant church. So that's one issue. Another issue is that Elizabeth is a woman. So there's this issue around the fact that she's female. Remember how much Henry VIII wanted a son. I mean, this was seen as a really big issue at the time, and it's because women were seen as being physically and emotionally and mentally weaker than men. And really, they were supposed to be ruled over by men. That was the natural way of things in the great chain of being. People didn't agree with women becoming queen, and Elizabeth is queen regnant. That means that she's queen in her own right. She's not queen because she's married to a king, she's queen because she's the queen. Now, the only other person who's been in this position for hundreds and hundreds of years by this point is Elizabeth's sister Mary, who was queen from 1553 to 1558. The problem is that Mary's reign doesn't really do much to convince people that queens are a good thing. So she marries Philip of Spain. So he's the King of Spain, Philip II. This is such an unpopular marriage that it actually leads to a rebellion in 1554 called the Wyatt Rebellion. And because Mary believes that Elizabeth was involved in that rebellion, she then imprisons her. So Elizabeth actually spends some time in prison before she becomes queen in the Tower of London. Mary also goes to war with France, or against France rather, and loses. England teams together with Spain and loses the war against France. So that doesn't make her any more popular. There's quite a lot of problems with poverty in England during Mary's reign, and then there's some crop failures as well, which lead to famine. People don't like that very much and they blame her for it. So there's poverty and famine. And then finally, because Mary is Catholic and rejoins the Church of England to the Roman Catholic Church, she also burns about 300 Protestants. And even though a lot of people at the time are Catholics, they still don't like this because it's a particularly painful and gruesome and awful spectacle. So Mary doesn't really do anything to convince the people of England that having a queen is a good thing, and this is an attitude that Elizabeth comes up against. Incidentally, her way of dealing with it is not to argue with people about women. If we have a look at this bit of a speech that she made in 1588 before the Spanish Armada, she said, "I know I have the body of but a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and the stomach of a king, and a king of England too." So she doesn't argue with people about their opinion of women. She actually agrees with it. And she says, yes, women are weak, but I'm not like other women. So that's how she deals with that. Now, the final issue for Elizabeth is the issue of marriage. Her title at the time was the Virgin Queen. Now, a virgin is someone who hasn't ever had sex, and this seems like a weirdly personal kind of a thing to put in your queen's title, but it was actually a compliment because people believed that sex outside of marriage was sinful, and Elizabeth wasn't married. It's not that people don't want to marry her either. Philip II of Spain, after he's been married to her sister who has died, wants to marry her. King Eric of Sweden wants to marry her as well. And so does the Duke of Alençon. To name but three, there are a lot of people who would like to marry Elizabeth, and there would be some advantages to this. One is that the monarch is supposed to lead their army in battle, and as a woman, Elizabeth couldn't do this. So getting married would mean that England had a military leader. Another advantage would be that she could have children, and then there would be someone obvious to take the throne after she died. Because when there isn't someone obvious to succeed the monarch, then it can cause problems and wars and people fall out over it. However, Elizabeth doesn't get married, and one reason for this is that she would lose authority. As the Queen, she has all the power, she has all the authority. If she'd got married, she would have had to share it, and she didn't want to do that. Another issue would be that if she married someone of her rank, like another king, then it would probably be a foreigner, and then they would prioritise other countries and not England. They would prioritise their own country, like Sweden or Spain. And that wasn't what Elizabeth wanted. So she doesn't get married. But all in all, Elizabeth has quite a lot to deal with when she becomes queen, purely because she is Elizabeth.